Welcome to the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast. I am the sports editor at the Herald Democrat, Della, Rosa, and welcome to Week 10 of the high school football season. First, I'll apologize for my voice. It is football weather, which sometimes means getting a cold weather. It's that time of year. I'm sure some of you are dealing with it as well, so I apologize in advance as we run down this week's games and look back at last week's action. We're getting to the last two games of the season. People are clinching playoff spots. People are in line for playoff spots. People are trying to stay alive and hopefully get that playoff appearance. So a lot of interesting games this week. And we will start, as we always do, at the top in District 7-5A, Division 1, where Sherman is traveling to West Mesquite. Sherman is sitting at 4-4, 1-3. West Mesquite is sitting at 2-6 and 2-2. And this is the crucial game in the district this week, because you have McKinney North on top. They have clinched a playoff spot. They are 5-0. Both Mesquite Poteet and John Tyler are sitting in second place at 3-1. And then you have West Mesquite sitting all alone in fourth place at 2-2. Sherman and Texas High are 1-3, and Wiley East is in the rear at 0-5. And this is very simple for the Bearcats. If they lose, they will be eliminated. West Mesquite will maintain its hold on fourth place. And if Sherman wins, they will have a chance at the playoffs once again in the game to close out the season against John Tyler at home. So Sherman needs to win. West Mesquite also needs to win, because if they lose, we could be looking at a potential three-way tie with West Mesquite, Texas High, and Sherman for fourth place in the district. So should be interesting. Sherman put themselves in this position with a 42-14 win against Wiley East last week. That was a game they had to win to keep this game against West Mesquite in play. Sherman was up 14-7 at halftime. They blew things open with 3 touchdowns in the third quarter. Mike Brown with the big game for the Bearcats. He had 23 carries for 204 yards and 4 touchdowns. Tate Bethel added a couple of touchdowns on the ground, and Wiley East was limited to under 200 yards of total offense, and they had 25 carries for 19 yards, so the Sherman defense came up big. When they went to the air, Gage Smith came up with a pair of interceptions, so pretty easy win for the Bearcats. Unfortunately, they didn't get help from Mesquite Poteet. West Mesquite was able to knock off their rivals 31-17. Otherwise, Sherman and West Mesquite would be tied going into the game this week. But like we said, Sherman still has a chance there. They have to get a win. Of note for Mike Brown, he went over 2,000 career rushing yards last week. And West Mesquite, like we mentioned, they would clinch the last playoff spot if they win and Wiley East beats Texas High. And that would lock up all 4 playoff spots in the district for 7-5A Division 1. The playoff situation in District 7-5A Division 2 is almost set. Denison is in the mix there, and they travel to Lovejoy. This is a battle of 2 first-place teams. As you might know, there is a 4-way tie for first place in that district. It is Denison, Lovejoy, Frisco, and Denton Braswell. They are all 5-1. And in a distant 5th place, but not so distant for Denison, and we'll get to that here in a moment, is Frisco Reedy at 4-3. So the scenarios going into these final 2 games, Denton Braswell, Frisco, and Lovejoy have all clinched playoff spots. And even though Denison is tied with them, I'm sure you're probably saying, well, how come Denison hasn't pushed a playoff spot? And the reason the Yellow Jackets haven't clinched is because they have a loss to Frisco Reedy. And the scenario that you don't want if you're a Denison fan is if Denison loses out against Lovejoy and Denton Braswell, who they host next week, and Frisco Reedy wins their last game against Princeton, then you would have a 4th place tie, and Denison would lose on the tiebreaker. So the Jackets know what they need to do. If they win this week against Lovejoy, they clinch a playoff spot. If they win next week against Denton Braswell, they would clinch a playoff spot if they were to lose to Lovejoy on Friday. Or if Princeton somehow beats Frisco Reedy in the last game of the season, that would clinch a spot for Denison, even if they lost out. But it's right there in front of Denison, also because they have a chance at the top seed for the playoffs. They have a chance to either win the district championship outright or share it in some capacity. So there's still a lot to play for Denison. They were able to hold off a a gritty Frisco Memorial team last week, 28-21. Memorial came in with just one win on the season, but the game was tied 7-7 at halftime. Denison had a 21-14 lead going into the fourth quarter. They were able to hang on. Asa Osborne had 2 touchdowns in the second half. He caught a 17-yard touchdown pass from Caleb Hevner, and then he scored on a 1-yard run early in the fourth quarter. That gave him a 2-score advantage. He finished with 19 carries for 86 yards. Hevner had 15 carries for 113 yards. He also threw for and ran in a touchdown. He also threw for 124 yards and 2 scores. And Jadarian Price had 23 carries for 148 yards as he's rounding into familiar form after dealing with the injury. He's really starting. The further he gets away from that, the better he's starting to look. And Zaylen Wimbish returned from injury. He was the starting quarterback for the season. He was injured in the second game. This was his first game back, and they moved him to receiver, and he had 3 catches for 103 yards and a touchdown. So, big game. Lovejoy also struggled considering the opponent last week. They took on Lake Dallas, and they had to hang on to win that one 28-26. Lake Dallas had a chance to convert a 2-point conversion with 1:45 left in that game. Lovejoy was able to stop that and avoid overtime, and that's why we have 2 teams that are both 6-2 and 5-1 squaring off. That should be a really good matchup. And like we said, if Denison can win that, they clinch the playoff spot, and they would be in position to win not only the district championship potentially outright, but also to earn the top seed for the playoffs. So a big game for the Jackets this week as we get closer to the end of the season. Next game on the list is Whitesboro is visiting Ponder in District 4-3A Division 1. Whitesboro had their bye last week, while Ponder lost 68-6 against Brock. Whitesboro comes into this matchup at 4-4 and 2-2 in district, while Ponder is sitting at 3-6 and 1-4. This is Ponder's last game. They have the district bye to finish out next week, so that's where they stand. Where Whitesboro stands in the district standings, they are currently all alone in 4th place. Pilot Point has already clinched the district championship and the number 1 seed. They are 5-0. Boyd and Brock are both 3-1 in 2nd place, and they play each other this week. So the winner of that essentially is going to be will have locked up 2nd place. And then Whitesboro sitting in 4th at 2-2. Paradise is at 1-3. Ponder's at 1-4, and Bowie is in last at 0-4. If Whitesboro wins, they can clinch a playoff spot. They are. And not only can they clinch a playoff spot, they can clinch a playoff spot, and they need Paradise to lose to Bowie. That probably will not happen, but at the very least, Whitesboro will be in a good spot. The reason they have to wait and see is because depending on the Boyd Brock loser, that is also a situation where if it's Boyd, that's who Whitesboro plays next week. So that could be a seeding game, or that could be trying to avoid a tiebreaker scenario with Paradise, Whitesboro, and that game's loser. So there's a maybe like a 10% chance that Pottsboro could clinch their playoff spot this week, but more than likely it'll come down to last week. But if they beat Ponder, they will be in really good shape. They will have beaten the bottom 3 teams. It's just a question of how things shake out around the rest of the district. So I expect that they're going to get that last spot, but we just have to wait to make that officially official. The next game is a big one, a big rivalry game in District 5-3A Division 1. You have Van Alstyne is at Howe. This is a key game for both teams. Van Alstyne comes into this game 4-4 and 3-1 after they had the bye last week. And Howe is 3-6 and 2-3. They're coming off a 20-14 loss against Commerce. To shake out the district standings, you have Pottsboro has already clinched at least a share of the district championship and the number 1 seed for the playoffs. They have the bye this week, so they're sitting at 5-0. Van Alstyne is currently in 2nd place by themselves. Rains is 2-2. They're in 3rd place with Commerce. Those two are tied. You have Howe at 2-3. Then you have Lone Oak at 1-3, and then you have Bonham at 0-4. This is a situation where it's pretty simple for Van Alstyne. If they win, they clinch a playoff spot. Howe needs to win to have a chance to see what happens next week, to see if they can stay alive. The loss to Commerce last week really hurt their chances. If they were sitting at 3-2 right now, they'd probably potentially sneak in next week. Ultimately, it's going to come down to who does what next week while they're not playing. So unfortunately, they're not going to have a say in it. Even if they do win to get to 3-3, they may need somebody to beat somebody after the games this week. We'll have to see what happens, because the Lone Oak is playing Emory Reigns and Commerce is playing Bonham. So going into the last week, we'll have to see what happens there. But if Howe loses, they will be eliminated. So that's a situation where they definitely need to find a way to pull this off. It will be tough, however, because Van Alstyne has won 12 straight against their rivals in the Silver Spike rivalry. The last Howe win in the series was in 2000. And like we said, Van Alstyne, obviously, this is not just a rivalry game. They will clinch a playoff spot if they win. If they lose, then we start talking about crazy tiebreakers with them. They would have to win their last game to avoid falling into a tie with Howe and potentially Emory Reigns. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that could happen in this district below Pottsboro to see who gets into the playoffs, and Van Alstyne doesn't want that to happen. Like we mentioned in the game last week, Howe was up early. It was the 20-14 loss against Commerce. They were up 7-0 at halftime. Leighton Ellington had an 80-yard interception return, and then Commerce tied it in the third quarter. But then Howe went back on top. They had a 14-6 lead after Jalen Thornton's 10-yard touchdown run. He finished with 22 carries for 91 yards. He also had 3 catches for 21 yards. And then in the fourth quarter is really where things turned. Commerce was able to tie the game, and then late in the game, Howe was deep in its own end. There was a fumble, and Commerce recovered it in the end zone, and that was the difference in the game. So that was a tough loss for the Bulldogs. Like we mentioned, that they could have been in a really good spot going forward this week. They could have potentially lost this week and still found a way to get in. So their path's a little harder, but they still have a shot, and we'll see what happens there. The next game on the list is in District 5-3A Division 2. Gunner is at Henrietta. Gunner is another team that had a bye last week. They come in at 7-1 and 4-0 in first place. Henrietta is coming off a 49-6 loss against City View, and they are 5-4 and 3-2. To look at those district standings, Gunner, like we mentioned, has clinched a playoff spot. If they win this week, that will clinch the top seed for the playoffs and at least a share of another district title. City View is currently sitting in second place at 3-1. Then you have Henrietta at 3-2. Nakona and Holiday are both 2-2. SNS, which has the district bye this week, is sitting at 1-4, and Callisburg is at 0-4. So that's where things stand in the district standings. This is a matchup that, like we said, they can clinch the top seed for the playoffs with victory, and you have a situation where it's a big game for Henrietta. There's a chance if they lose this game, they could end up getting left out of the playoffs. Holiday and Nakona play each other this week, so the winner of that is going to have the upper hand, at least by a game, and so this would be a big win to get for Henrietta. Gunner's going to finish with Callisburg next week, so this is probably their last tough test. Callisburg's 0-8 and 0-4 in the district, like we mentioned, after they lost to SNS last week. And just to give a little quick shout out to SNS, because they don't play, we don't have a game to talk about this week. They after they had won their game last week, they had another game this past week where they lost 25-8, but again, it was a much closer game. You can see that the Rams are better after they had lost. They had ended their losing streak 2 weeks ago, and they might be able to maybe sneak something out at the last game of the season, but they're sitting at 1-8 and 1-4 in the district standings.